I don't think I've ever talked about that specifically. It got me on stuff that I usually keep for myself. The relationship between Christians and Jews is a very, very deep one. It's one that starts right at the very beginning. And I'm like, why another war? Are we going into another, are we really going to war again in the Middle East again? At least it's revealing to you that Jerusalem is the center of the world, folks. You can't get rid of that. It just is.
Christ on the cross in Israel, which is the symbol of the cross, kind of converging the quadrants into this one place, like an X on the map.
So you have all of these things circling around the center of the world, fighting and arguing, and if we're not able to reintegrate our stories and to start to see ourselves as continuous, instead of constantly wanting to break with the past and see ourselves as revolutionary, there's no solution to the problem. One of the things about the end of the post-World War II consensus is also the end of secularity. So now you have people identifying as witches, not only witches, as the witches that were burnt in the 16th century, saying we are the witches you tried to burn, and we are now casting curses on the president. And the satanic imagery is... They followed Kanye since the beginning. He's like a tuning fork. He seems to be able to show us what is coming. And then I saw him kind of toying with Nazi imagery, and I thought, oh my, this is bad news, folks. It's weird, because I'm not saying, oh, the Jews control the world. I'm not saying any of that. It's not even the Jews that are doing it precisely. It's this.
What we gaze upon becomes us in some real sense. I wanted to ask you about what has gone wrong in the world of art, certainly in the world of film. We have non-human disembodied powers of AI that now influence our lives, like ghostly spirits. I was wondering how you navigate this line between the political and the sacred. St. Isaac the Syrian once said that there's one thing more powerful than 1,000 armies, and that's a pure heart in the wilderness. Fairy tales that we read our children are some of the most important things that our children will consume, because it lays the foundational framework through which they can interpret reality.
It's like all the things we're talking about now, they make my heart bleed.
All right, Jonathan Pageau, I really can't tell you how thrilled I am to have you on the show. I am a big admirer of your work. I think your insights have been hugely influential on me and many, many other people, and honestly has changed the way I kind of see the world. And I wanted to have you on the show because we are living through truly mythic times right now. And I think in order to make sense of it, I don't think we need primarily another political analyst or military expert or journalist, but someone who's versed in the language of symbolism and pattern, who can help us decode what's unfolding right before our eyes. And just a few examples of this right now are that there's this looming threat of World War III erupting from none other than the Holy Land. We have this kind of Lord of the Rings-like prospect of the return of the king of Iran to replace this kind of orc-like regime of the Islamic Republic, where I grew up as a child. Heroes and villains from the Second World War are being inverted and kind of falling from heaven like cast out angels as we topple the statues of the good guys and raise the symbols of the bad guys. We have non-human disembodied powers of AI that now influence our lives, like ghostly spirits that we go to for, knowledge, like oracles. And just like Eve in the garden, we are being tempted again with the knowledge of good and evil, except this time the snake is in our back pocket, in our Apple iPhone, and social media is now this tree of knowledge, which is luring us in with the weaponization of morality, of good and evil, and into judgment without mercy, and causing us all to fall into this kind of deeper darkness. And so the question I have for you to kick things off, and I mean this literally, is this the end of the world as we know it?
I don't think we should be, how can I say this? I think the best way to understand it is that we're at the end of something. People always say that I'm being tricky when I say that. It's hard to know the scale of what it is that's ending. For sure, we are at the end of a big cycle. We're at the end of we are at some civilizational moment. It seems like many elements are kind of crunching together. The end of the Enlightenment thinking, a kind of return, like you've been mentioning in your original comment, a kind of return of mythical thinking. It's happening to us, it's kind of being forced on us through all these different things that are happening. And so I think that we are definitely at the end of, we're at a civilization moment, we're at the end of something. Whether it's the end of the entire world is hard to is hard to know, and it's hard to say what exactly that means. I think that the eschatological language in Scripture is in some ways always present, and so it represents the end, of course, but that end is always looming on us at different scales. So it's a good way to understand how things end, you could say, uh, and so we can be attentive to those signs when we're looking at the signs of the times and see how things are playing out. Does that make sense? Like that I'd
Absolutely.
be very careful. I'm very cautious in that kind of predictive mode in terms of, and I also don't want people to become, because people become panicked, when we say it's the end of the world. Um, it's better to just have a kind of calm attention to be able to see what's going on.
Yeah. I think, I share the sentiment. I think when it comes to this end of the world, I think I mean it literally in the sense that I'm literally talking the figurative sense of the word world and what we've been
Well, oh,
occupying.
for sure, it's the end of a world. I mean, in the sense that there's a world that's ending, and there is a world that's already glimmering on the horizon. There's no doubt about that. Uh, in some ways, we've seen increased cycles of these kind of cataclysmic events. As the modern world kind of uh, played itself out, you could say. But now it's a much bigger one. And so there's a lot of things that have been building up, you could say, since the end of the Middle Ages, that are kind of coming to a head.
Okay, interesting. Well, I'd love to get into that a little bit later on. First of all, I wanted to get your thoughts on something which has been circulating, I think, in your world as we're all starting to wonder what's really been going on. And you coined the phrase and made a tremendous video, which was titled the end of the World War II consensus. And I really wanted to ask you to lay that out for us and share what exactly you mean by that, because as we speak, the last living survivors and witnesses of Auschwitz, of Stalin's purges, of witnesses to the radioactive dawn of Hiroshima are vanishing before us, and with them we are losing not just their memory but the anchorage to that story, which is now unraveling. And I was wondering if you could just elaborate on that, and also maybe share what some of the flaws were with that kind of false idol of a story that has guided us for the last sort of 80 years.
Yeah. So, I mean, my contention is that all worlds, you could say, if you understand a world as a kind of set of coherent facts that hold together and kind of give you a sense that you have stability, right? So a day is a world, a week is a world, your family is a world. So you have these different set of constraints that give you a sense of continuity and stability through life. But you have big ones, and those kind of hold giant narratives together. They kind of hold big stories, and they also hold geopolitical maps together, you could say. And so the one that we're living in now is the end of World War II. And so World War One was the evacuation of a long-standing world with the end of the Ottoman Empire and the end of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and it's like all and the Russian Empire. And so all of these empire-led worlds vanished after World War One, and the nation state became really the only structure that to kind of pervade. And then by the end of World War II, that's all. Let's say we had a new beginning. You could call it a new beginning for a world, and it was based on a certain way that we understood who were the good guys, who were the bad guys in World War II, the alliances that we made, and it created a form of stability, a real stability. I mean, we've had an amazing run now since the end of World War II, in the sense that we've lived in the most safety and comfort. Most of us, not everyone in the world, but let's say most people in the West have lived in a type of safety and comfort that is unheard of in the history of humanity, possibly. And so it's been in some ways a kind of amazing thing. But there's also there was also certain little lies in the origin story, and those lies, I want to be careful not to blame anyone and not to accuse anyone. All origin stories have taboos in them. That's part of what an origin story is, and it's very simple. It's like, in order to create a world, you have to decide what's inside, and you kind of have to exclude certain things, because the world, there's too much. You have to kind of exclude things in order to create a boundary. And that's what happened at the end of World War II. We created a basic narrative, which was that we won the war, we beat the bad guys, we beat Stalin. Sorry, we beat Hitler, but the secret that this is why I said Stalin. Like the secret in some ways is that we allied ourselves with a very, very evil person in order to beat another very, very evil person. And especially in America and I think in Western Europe, there's a kind of whitewashing of that where we celebrate. Of course, we have to celebrate our winning of the war because it founds a new world. But that secret, in some ways, is still there, and it created a certain story, which let's say certain side effects in the story, and those side effects now are becoming more and more apparent in a manner that is making the whole kind of consensus that story gave us start to fragment and possibly collapse. I don't know how long it's still going to last, but it's definitely fragmenting because the side effects have become too prominent.
Is this why, you have people still in the West that will say, well, communism just wasn't tried well enough before, we need to give it another go, and they'll happily raise, the hammer and sickle flag at universities. Pretty much every city I've ever been to over the last 6 years will have constant posters across the city for the latest socialist rally or Marxist rally. But you don't get people saying, oh, well, we just didn't try Nazism well enough. It's never been tried before.
Exactly.
Is that
nobody's saying that?
Yeah.
So
is that kind of
it's you've got it right, and this is something that is just narratives have a certain amount of narratives have real pressure, like they create real pressure on situations, and they frame things and they kind of direct things. So this is something that we always need. You need a purpose, you need an origin, you need these things in order to be able to leave your home in the morning, go to work, and then come back. But those pressures are real. So when you leave your home in the morning, you remember your home and you go to work, and then you know where to go when you come back. So it's like you're not gonna go to the street next to yours when you come back home, because there's a narrative pressure, which is a completely coherent and real one, to link you to certain things. And so this is how narratives function. Now, one of the problems in the World War II narrative is that we, in some ways, because we allied with a horrible person, and we allied with the communists in order to beat the Nazis, although we at the outset kind of didn't like the communists, and there was a little bit of a wave in America especially, and a little bit in the UK, to prevent the rise of communism, but it didn't last long. It lasted 10 years. And then after 10 years, that little taboo about how we beat the Nazis using the communists started to play itself out. And what I mean is that it means that there's a little open door for more left-leaning thinking, and the door towards the right is closing and closing and closing, because what happens is everything on the right starts to slowly and more be identified with the Nazis that we beat, and things on the left, because we had this weird taboo in it, they start to open up and open up and open up. And so what happens is the communist thinkers infiltrate the universities. The communist thinking slowly it's not just communist. It's more insidious than communism. It's more like kind of non-identity internationalism is a good way to think about it, right? This idea that identities in terms of nations, families, race, ethnic, tribal, whatever, these are all in some ways all evil unless they're revolutionary. If they're revolutionary, then we can stomach them for a while, and then once we do, we get rid of them because we're looking towards this kind of non-identity internationalism, and so that starts to grow until basically now we're in a serious problem, which is that there is no right. There's only the extreme right. The right doesn't exist anymore. Anybody who's right of Mao is basically the extreme right, and so now it can't hold. It's going to collapse because that type of thinking can't hold the world anymore. Even though the push is going to continue, but it's ultimately going to shatter the whole story.
Yeah. So do you think this has been, this kind of this problem, some of the problems that were ingrained in the foundation of this new post-World War consensus, that the flaws are now playing out in real time? We're running the experiment and we're seeing, now it's seen as fascist to want to have secure borders. And so what it does is it just threatens the national security and all those kinds of things. Is that what you're referring to?
That's the idea. And so in some ways what happens is in some ways you have fascism, which is the real fascism, like a tyrant that controls everybody and establishes this like extremely harsh police type order, that's fascism, let's say, and it's related to excluding the stranger and to kind of national identity or ethnic identity or whatever. Right, that's fascism. But then what happens is the definition of fascism begins to grow and grow and grow until the very normal, regular things that have to do with the preservation or the maintaining of identity become identified with fascism. You can see how that would happen, right? Because they're not completely unrelated, right? The idea of, let's say, a strong tyrant that holds the country together. There is an analogy between a father and a family in that thing. And even in the political discussion, we'll use those imageries to talk about the father of the nation and all these kinds of languages. So it's not like this is completely arbitrary. But what happens is, because there's no, how can I say this? The doors open on one side and the doors closed on the other. The door keeps getting closed more tightly until you say something like families are fascist. Having children is fascist. Like anything you say, like having a border is fascist. Like anything that tends towards identity, like kind of normal identity, is fascist. And then we open up the door more and more to anything that is revolutionary identity or lack of identity or ambiguous identity.
Yeah. There does seem to be, though, this kind of Ouroboros inbuilt into this, though, because even during the Soviet Union, where you had, okay, so we're going to split the world into you're the oppressor and we're the oppressed, let's get rid of all the oppressors. And then you had just the oppressed left. And then they were like, well, some of these oppressed people have a few more potatoes than we do, so then we have to kill those off. And then it just gets smaller and smaller, and it just eats its own tail. And with this kind of hyper, I don't know what to call it, hyper liberal, hyper woke, hyper inclusive thing, it tends to just eat itself, where, now it's not enough to just be, a disabled black person. You have to be a disabled black gay person. It goes, where that is what becomes the pinnacle of moral superiority, being the most oppressed. And so everyone's got this race down to the bottom in order to escape the kind of big bad guy of being Hitler. Is that fair to say?
That's exactly what's happening, and we saw it happen. But now the thing is that it is collapsing. So we're noticing that it's falling. That story is losing its grip. It's going to continue to fight for a while. The fight will continue. But let's say if you compare 2020 or like 2016, 17, around there, you can see that the madness of the narrative, like the narrative of this, like you said, it's Ouroboros constantly excluding until you how can I say, nobody's actually left except for the crazy clown trans disabled, there's almost nothing left, and you have to celebrate that, not only accept it. That's also part of why it ate its own tail, is that at some point, at first it was tolerance. It's like, we have to tolerate people that are different than us. And then it was like, well, you don't have to tolerate, you have to accept. But then now it's not just you have to accept, you have to celebrate. It's not just tolerate, it's not just accept, now it's celebrate. And so last year, was it 2 years ago, we had Pride Day, and then we had Pride Week, and then we had Pride Month, and then we had Pride Season, right? So Justin Trudeau established Pride Season, which was the entire summer. But now we are in Pride this month. Have you heard much about it? Exactly. So it's like the story is collapsing, and this whole thing is kind of, it's not completely collapsing, but it is. And the question, and that's why reason why I'm ringing the alarm bell is because what will replace it, if we're not careful, the danger is that we'll replace it with a caricature of the other side, and that has been growing underground, you could say. So underground, there's been a sense in which those that have been marginalized from the story, those that have been excluded from the story, they're gathering their resentment, and you can understand that. Like, you understand why it's happening, and many people have identified now with that which was excluded in World War II, and are saying, hey, maybe they look at the result of our world now. Look at what happened. So maybe we were wrong. Maybe the other side was right. Maybe we made a mistake the whole time, and that's the danger, is to instead of trying to find a way to synthesize and to find a balanced perception of the world, there's a danger in flipping to the other side completely, and to start to re-celebrate the devil of our world.
Well, this is why I've said before, it feels like the world is spinning. What used to be taboo, what was, ushered quietly on weird internet forums, has now become daily conversations in coffee shops. It seems like everyone's grandmother is on Facebook posting about, the aliens that are controlling our government, or, about, or strange like Nazi ideas. Like there are people that I know of who work in hospitals, that work in restaurants and schools, that are now very much sympathizers of the Nazis. And so the question I had for you is that there is this strange phenomena where brutal military leaders or dictators, after a few decades or even a few centuries, they just start to lose their monster-like quality, and they start becoming like these fascinating, attractive characters, especially to those people who are potentially like excluded from the story. And I think this might be a good opportunity to ask you about Kanye West, who seems to be fitting that archetype really, really well. And you've described him as almost like prophetic figure, because you can just pay attention to him and figure out what's going to happen next. So I was wondering, could you elaborate on Kanye West?
Talk about Kanye. And so it's weird. I mean, I followed Kanye since the beginning, since Jesus Walks. What is it? That 2004, I think it was. Um, and I really understood that he had something different than all the others, and that he also had a kind of, he's like a tuning fork. He catches things. He seems to be able to predict, to participate, to show us what is coming. And I also had this intuition very early on that he was going to flip. He was going to go from the decadent, completely decadent rapper to flip into something like a Christian or something like that. And that's what happened in, I think it was 2019. And this flip, it's related to what it is we're saying. In some ways, when you go too far on one side, or when you start to manifest certain characteristics, like even the social narrative, like Weimar at some point went too far, and then all of a sudden there's a switch, and it's not a progressive change. It's like a pendulum, going way too far, and then all of a sudden you're like, wait, why is the pendulum going the other way all of a sudden? It's because you pulled it too far this way. And so this is what I kind of had this intuition that would happen to Kanye. So when he announced that he was going to become a Christian, I was like, okay, well, it looks like we're going to have a massive Christian revival. And that's what happened, by the way. It's like after COVID, now our churches, the Orthodox churches, are just bursting at the seams in North America. More traditional Catholic churches also are just full of young people. The demographics are still are going down in terms of full participation. Like the older people are still leaving, and the numbers. But if you look at who's there and who's coming, you realize that it's all the young people that are coming into the church. And so even though statistically it doesn't look that way, there is a major transformation happening. Anyways, and then I saw him kind of toying with Nazi imagery, and I thought, oh my, this is bad news, folks. Like, this means that this is the next thing that's happening. And and it's intuitive to him. Like, for him, it's not I don't know how thought out it is. It's intuitive, it's personal, it's all this stuff going on. But he's also exposing certain things, that he's kind of exposing the faults in the story. He's exposing some of the cracks in the story, and it's happening. You can't really stop it. His song, the HH song, there are things on Spotify that are a million times worse than that song. Like, there are songs about people raping children, about killing their girlfriend, murdering. Like, there are insane, crazy songs on Spotify. But that's the thing, obviously, that you cannot touch. Like, it's the taboo that you cannot touch. And his song, it's funny because his song is a contradiction. His song is not it's not a Nazi hymn. If you listen to the actual song, you realize that it's actually a complete contradiction, because he uses a slur against black people, and then he calls them with that slur to say Heil, and then in the song he calls himself a cuck. Like, he says that he likes to watch people sleep with his wife, and then he says crazy, insane, degenerate things, and then he says, and you're like, this song is a complete contradiction. It's like you talked about Oracle. It's like throwing the bones, right? It's like looking into a pool of water, right? It's looking into the Palantir or whatever. But it's revealing the structure. Like, it's revealing what's kind of the forces that are behind. But that's going to happen a lot more, and you see it. Like, in some ways, he shook things, and now you have all of these people questioning the World War II narrative openly. Historians or semi-historians and podcasters and all of these people.
Yeah. Yeah,
And it's not
my comments are filled with it. I don't know about yours, but my comments are just filled with the Jews run the world, and they have to spell Jews all these kind of strange ways because in case the Jews catch them,
get censored.
Yeah.
Well, that's what I think that's what's going on. We have to be able, in some ways, the problem is that we're not allowed to talk about this, right? And so the fact that we're not allowed to talk about this is a bad sign, right? And you understand why? Because the Jews were slaughtered in World War II. Like, the Jews were eradicated in ways that are insane for any type of thinking. Like, the way what happened to them is crazy. And so you can understand why, there would be a taboo against criticizing Jews and against attacking them or saying things about them, because what happened is insane. But the reality is also that if you maintain that, you're perpetuating the thing you're trying to stop, right? So if you try to maintain this insane level of censorship where you're not allowed to criticize Jewish people because of what happened in World War II, which, like I said, it's completely reasonable. But ultimately, if you keep doing that for a very long time, at some point, you're going to perpetuate the very thing that you're trying to stop. And I think that that's what we're seeing at this point. So what you see with Kanye is, Kanye goes against Jewish people, and then he loses everything. He loses all his deals. He loses his Spotify account. He loses billions of dollars. He loses his bank account within just a few days. And then you think, guys, what is happening? It's like, are you proving his point? Why? And it's like I said, it's weird because I'm not saying, the Jews control the world. I'm not saying any of that. It's not even the Jews that are doing it precisely. It's the story that's doing it. And because it's a bunch of Protestants and a bunch of secular people. It's all these people that are just like afraid that we're going to go back to the Nazi period. It's not the Jews per se, but it's the story itself that's kind of pushing. But if we don't relent if we don't find ways for a valve to be able to kind of release some of the pressure, then we're going to create this, we're going to, without even knowing it, we're going to create the same situation that happened in the 1930s. And we're going to rehash the same story. Because we haven't learned we're not learning from let's say the side effects of this. Like, we're not integrating it properly. I don't know if that makes sense.
It makes total sense. And I think it's the first time I've heard you make that distinction between, and not there's this idea that like the Jews run the world, and you're saying, look, it's not so much that the Jews running the world, it's the story that integrates the Jews and their victimhood that is kind of the paradigm which is running the Western world, so to speak. And that distinction is important. And I agree, because by doing that to Kanye, you're only kind of fanning the flames of this kind of martyrdom that he would be going through, that says that, well, look, see, we proved you right. Like, this is exactly what you said was going to happen, and it happened, which is kind of making him into a bigger beast than if you just kind of like left him alone and kind of let him out of the closet every now and again and have a little bit of a fun and game with him. Now you've turned him into an actual martyr.
Yeah, exactly. So this is and in some ways it's difficult because the trauma that Jewish people went through is real beyond belief. Like, it's not only real, but it is normally and understandably perpetuated in the descendants of the people that went through the Holocaust, right?
And let's not forget also that the cost of the Nazi rhetoric against the Jews wasn't only felt by the Jews. Of course they were in the gas chambers, but all of Europe was in flames. Like Christians, like everyone was. Like, everyone sent their young men off to war and didn't come back. And so part of the taboo is also like, just stop. But like, last time this happened, not only did the Jews die, but all of us did.
Yeah.
The cost is really really high.
So the problem is that there's also a secret desire that is part of noticing that this story is falling apart, right? And that this is more difficult even to talk about, because there is a desire to see a refounding. People are looking for order. People are looking for something to give them a sense that the world makes sense. And the one thing that makes you feel like the world makes sense is war. That is the one thing that you can easily it's not even conscious. Like if it comes about, then it gives directionality to our nations. It gives directionality to our people. People that are lazy and lost and wandering all of a sudden are motivated and directed. And so there is in the culture, in the zeitgeist, there is a yearning for war. You can feel it. It's crazy. I mean, in the 1980s and 90s, we did everything possible to avoid nuclear war, right? It was like that was motivating everything. Now we act as if Russia, for example, doesn't even have nukes. We just kind of act as if and we almost act as if there's an inevitable like nuclear war in the future, folks. Like just get used to that. Get used to the idea that at some point there's going to be some kind of nuclear exchange. There's a weird like yearning to see the world kind of burn so that we can find a new beginning. And that is a frightening thing to notice. Like it's a frightening thing to see in the media, in the political class, but even in normal people, like this kind of, this desire for a new sacrifice that will give us a new beginning.
Gosh, Jonathan, there's like a million directions I want to go with that because so much is coming to mind because
look, I don't think I've ever talked about that specifically, or have I? Anyways, you got me on stuff that I usually keep for myself.
Yeah, no, I'll keep it coming. So this is the thing. This is one of the remarkable things about Christ as the eternal sacrifice, because there's something about Christ on the cross as this sort of lamb slain before the foundation of the world that it's not like you might be able to articulate this better than me, but there's something in the zeitgeist that is satisfied if you just keep if that is at your focus, if you know what I mean. If you get rid of Christ on the cross, your society is left wandering and figuring out, okay, we need a sacrifice, we need a scapegoat, right? We need something. There's like a bloodlust for sacrifice, whether that be child sacrifice, whatever it is. That, like you mentioned, there's something there driving it, and it feels inevitable. Like I agree with you. Like I'm seeing the stuff on my social media, and like despite me trying to show with restraint when I'm trying to post stuff, it just seems to be inevitable. Like it's just adding to this tapestry that kind of runs away from you. You know, it's out of our control almost, it feels like.
Yeah, and I do think that, I mean, obviously I'm a Christian. I do think that Christ is the answer. I think that because one of the things that it's hard for people to understand, like I think we now in a moment where people can understand a little more this desire for sacrifice. Because we, like you said, we're seeing it kind of coming about in the way that we either, whichever side of the war we're on, like either in Russia or in the Israel-Palestine, or like all these wars, it doesn't even matter what side you're on, but you can kind of see this, like you said, this bloodlust to see something happen in order to stabilize the world. And we have a weird intuition that violence is part of that stabilization. Of course, René Girard has analyzed this as a sociologist, and there are different people that have analyzed it in different ways. But what the cross does, in some ways, it reminds us that in some ways we have to offer ourselves up as sacrifices, and that is actually the best way for the sacrifice to happen. And that if people offer themselves up as the sacrifice, then it diffuses the tension, right? It actually diffuses the opposition in a conflict. It's hard because who wants to do that? I don't want to do that. You know, there's a crazy story about how the Roman games ended, about how the gladiatorial fights ended. Because when people converted to Christianity, you know, for a while, those games continued. Like people were converting, and there were still, you know, it's hard to stop something once it's part of society. And the way, at least according to our tradition, the way it stopped is that one day a Christian went down into the arena and stood between the two gladiators, and then the gladiator killed the person, and the person died and became, in some ways, a martyr, and everybody in the audience saw it, and they just walked out, and that was it. That was the end of the games, because someone was willing to put their life on the line in order to stop, but not in a way that was self-sacrificial. So obviously we don't need to do all crazy things like that. In some ways it's the opposite of a, it's funny because it's the opposite of a Muslim martyr, right? It's like,
Exactly.
it's
I've
like
always
you're
talked about
not
this.
you're
Yeah.
not going in to suicide bomb yourself to like destroy as much as possible. You're going in and offering yourself in a situation of conflict as a kind of intermediate, someone willing to give themselves to atone for the animosity between the two sides.
Yeah.
Um,
But
and
also as a way of transforming what suffering even means. So if you look at like St. Ignatius of Antioch and his willingness to be ground into the flour, the wheat of Christ through the jaws of the lions, it's remarkable to read those letters from St.
yeah,
Ignatius. And there is something transformative about willing self-sacrifice that just transcends everything. And
yeah,
I think
and then
Tertullian, yeah.
like I think that for us, we don't obviously need to do that. I mean, most of us are not called to do something as extreme, but it does remind you that, in fact, one of the things that you can do to refound a world is to give yourself to that world. So it means to your family, it means to your community, it means to your church. It means, it's like those are things that actually do stabilize the world. We don't necessarily have the power individually, maybe some of us do, but very few of us, to stabilize an entire geopolitical conflict. But we definitely do have the power to stabilize and to found little stories that we participate in. And that has a cumulative effect.
So there's a few directions. Like I said, there's a million to go in here, but there's two visuals that are coming to my mind. So I was born in the UK, and the British flag is well known across the world, but many people don't realize that it's a layering of crosses with the
Yeah.
Union Jack. You've got you've got the cross of St. George, you've got the cross of St. Andrew, and then you've got the cross of St. Patrick. And the establishing of that flag, it represents the giving of the lives of these saints, of these martyrs, of these mythic figures that became the bedrock of an entire nation. And in the cathedrals, in the churches, were the relics, the bones of these people who gave their lives, the saints. And from that sacrifice was born entire towns, entire nations from that. And what's crazy to think is today that like almost everyone I know in the UK just has no idea what the flag means anymore. And so growing up, I used to walk around and it was St. George's Street and St. Lawrence Street and St. Luke Street. And it just went completely over my head. Like we're so detached from the origin story that we're occupying on a daily basis that it's just become vapid. And I think one of the things that has happened now, going from someone without faith to going on that faith journey and attending the Orthodox Church, is the juxtaposition has become huge. Where I can start to see that, for example, I married my wife. I know I love my wife, but I didn't really know what marriage was. Like I just did it. Like we got married, but I had no idea about what the sacrament, like what's a sacrament? What does this even mean? And things just within the church just have so many more layers of meaning that just integrate the world. And when it comes to, whether it be the churches you go to with the relics or the streets that are named after these saints that might have been martyred somewhere in, modern day Turkey, like 1,500 years ago, it integrates you into a sense of time that breaches, millennia, but also is kind of ever present and alive today, which is first of all amazing. Now, there's probably stuff that we can talk about here. I don't know if I want to catch your thoughts on anything there quickly before I move on to the next thing. Is there anything that comes up for you?
Yeah, I think that in some ways, maybe we're in a good position to understand that a little more now. So, for all the evil that our church or the Catholic Church or, the different churches have done, because they have done really horrible things. I think we can also notice, like you said, in some ways, the stabilizing and connecting thing that it does. So there's been this interesting controversy online about Christ is King. I don't know if you followed it, where people started saying Christ is King, and other people even my friends started to object to that, saying that it was based in anti-Semitism and all this stuff, whatever. What's interesting about the Christ is King controversy is that a lot of the people that are using it more in a weaponized way today are usually very nationalistic and have that, that kind of stance. But the Feast of Christ the King, which was actually founded after World War I by the Pope and was recognized by many of the churches, like even Anglicans and more Protestant churches and everything, was actually it was a bulwark against nationalism. It was actually trying to say, remember that Christ is your king. Remember that you are not, yes, you are an Englishman, yes, you are German, yes, you are French, like you have these national alliances that are important, but remember that you have a king that is beyond these small allegiances, and that king, of course, is the king that gave himself, is the sacrificial king. It's a different king from the one you follow in your nation. And so you see, like even in the 20th century, often the church has been able to play a role of attempting to diffuse some of these crazy narratives that have taken over.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, speaking of kind of crazy narratives that are going on, I want to bring it back to the sort of Israel topic just for a little while longer. Now, one of the great meta narratives that held the post-World War II story together was the moral clarity that came from Jews being cast at the absolute bottom of the hierarchy as just powerless victims. And prior to the 20th century, the foundation of the West was also Jewish blood in some sense, in the form of Christ. Now, since the war with Israel in recent times, it feels like something in that story has just snapped completely. Could it be that seeing Jews not as victims anymore, but as agents with power, with military strength, even with the capacity to kill, has short-circuited that ingrained narrative, triggering a kind of self-destruct mode of the post-World War II consensus? And could this explain the disproportionate amount of attention and hate that Jews get today when there are countless other wars and land disputes that are just so much bigger that like no one just cares about anymore, that no one cares about them? Tell me your thoughts on that.
Yeah, these are difficult things to talk about because they touch on very foundational stories. And so the relationship in the West between Christians and Jews is a very, very deep one. It's one that, as you said, starts right at the very beginning. And it, how can I say this? One of so the story of Christianity starts with the killing of a Jewish man, right? It starts with the killing of Christ. The Christ is killed by both the Jews and the Romans, right? So think about that. It's this weird thing. But in the story, Pontius Pilate washes his hands of the murder and says, "This is on you, right? This is you. You're the ones doing this." Of course, he's not innocent, but in the story, that's part of it. And then what happens is that after the death of Christ, then his followers are persecuted by the Jewish nation, and they're seen as heretics. And there's even a prayer that's developed to curse the heretics, and the Nazarites are part of the heretics that are cursed. So you have this very difficult, they get excluded from the synagogue. This is a very difficult situation where in some ways the Christians become marginalized within the Jewish community, become kind of excluded. And then they also get excluded by the Romans, right? So for completely irrelevant reasons, it looks like in terms of causalities, they get blamed for the destruction of Rome, the fire by Nero, and then they get persecuted in Rome by the Jews, by the Romans for 300 years on and off, you could say. And then the biggest flip in the history of the world, if you can think of a bigger, coup d'état, like a bigger shift happening in the history of the world, I don't know if there is one. So now you also have to remember, part of the story is also very important, is that the Romans destroyed Jerusalem, right? So while all this is happening, right, the Christians are being persecuted by the Jews, the Romans are persecuting the Christians in Rome, and then the Romans destroy Jerusalem. They destroy the temple. They annihilate temple worship. They annihilate the sacrifice system so that it has never been restored ever since in the last 2,000 years. It's a crazy moment, right? So now think of this whole weird situation. Then the Romans become Christians. What the hell? It's the most insane thing. Like people, like how can you not realize how crazy this is? The Romans that destroyed Jerusalem, that destroyed Jewish sacrificial system, now identify with this little marginalized group that has been persecuted for 300 years, and everything completely upends.
It's insane.
The entire power dynamic,
Yeah.
the entire power structure now inverts. You know, before that, there are accusations by, you see it in Eusebius, you see it in some of the fathers, that, you know, there were times when Jews would denounce the Christians to the Romans because they already didn't like them very much, and so they would denounce them to the Romans. It's like now all of a sudden it completely flips. Now all of a sudden the Christians are on top. And then now what? So, like, it's weird that people don't realize just how deep the relationship between Rome, that is the West, Christians, and Jews is. It's born in this insane trauma, you know, of a few centuries that is hard to even disambiguate in your mind. Like, it's so deep at how deep the relationship is. And so first of all, think about it that way. So that's what happens. And then this is something people forget in the story. People don't realize how crazy it is that when the Christians ascend and become powerful, all the old religions go away. All the other old religions disappear. So nobody worships Jupiter anymore. Nobody worships, you know, the gods. And there's only one that's kept. Which one? Judaism is maintained. So the Christians maintain Judaism. The Christians, they don't destroy the Judaism. All the other cults go away. Everything else just vanishes after a few centuries. The only one that is maintained is Judaism. And then that's the relationship. They're maintained as a marginal aspect of their story for all the good and bad that brings. So they're treated as marginal. They have all the negative aspect of that, where they're excluded, where they don't really participate. But they also have a lot of advantages, because in some ways they're like a kind of free-floating system amongst Christians, and they're able to mediate a lot of things that the Christians can't do themselves. So they end up in a huge system. They end up playing a very important part in this whole system. And it's like you can't. So when people don't understand, like, why all eyes on Israel and all eyes on the relationship still between the West and the Jews, it's like it's so deep. And I'm not saying that like it's good or bad, or one is good or one. Nobody's good or bad in this situation. It's just this is a narrative that we cannot be completely. It can't be ignored, right? And so when you see people say, like I was, you know, you see a lot of the more anti-Israel people say, like, why do we care so much? Like, why is it such a big deal? It's like you if you could see the deep narrative continuity from the last 2,000 years, you would realize that you can't take your eyes off this relationship, because it defines the West in many, many important ways. So anyway, so that's a really important to understand. It's important to, like, I'm not saying I have like complete clarity of vision on the entire structure and how all this works. But what I can tell you is that it's not surprising, because it is so fundamental to the way in which the West ended up being founded, especially in its Christianization, and how that was related to Judaism. It's super important.
But what is it's super important, but it's also super weird. Like, what does that even mean for the entire West to kind of gain its identity in some sense from this tiny strip of land, like on the edge of the Mediterranean, and which is the beginning of like the Middle East? That's just so strange in and of itself. And then,
I love how you say it's the edge of the Mediterranean. You could also say it's actually the center of the world. Look at a map.
well,
again.
okay.
Look at the map and tell me what's at the middle.
Yeah.
Like,
Well,
even like
there you go.
think about it now. Just see a map in your mind and ask yourself what's in the middle. It's
That's
like
true.
the Jerusalem is in the center of the world, and It's like it's actually not accidental. It's like
But
all the
okay, so this is
maps.
what I'm trying to get at though. It's like not only do we kind of conceive of it that way, but there's also just like thousands of years of prophecies before there was any sort of knowledge of like far-flung civilizations or cartography of maps and stuff that, going back thousands of years, that this was the Holy Land. Like it was, from Abraham and Isaac and all of that kind of stuff. There's a kind of layer of this that just boggles my mind because it's just steeped in mystery, just so much mystery. And then you'd also assume, like, especially from a kind of naive to theology perspective, that you'd say, well, how can it be the Holy Land? There's so much blood and violence going on. Surely the Holy Land is like some temple in Tibet somewhere, that's just ever peaceful and just there's incense burning, just no one's
It's
disturbing
literally called
it.
the City of Peace, which is it's like the deepest irony in the world is that Jerusalem means the City of Peace, and so
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
like but then it's just been a constant place of conflict.
yeah. And also, Bill, that's the name Israel, right?
Yeah,
Those
yeah,
who,
and so
that
he who finds God, yeah, he who
exactly. So there's just, I can't make sense of it. To hear that you're still trying to make sense of it kind of worries me because I was kind of hoping you'd have some answers because this is just, it
No, I
occupies
mean,
my mind.
I think I have some insights into in some ways what's going on, but I don't think I completely understand it. So of course, one of the things that happened, of course, the founding of Israel, no matter how you think about it, no matter how ironic it is, and how it's how related to dispensationalism it is, or how related to like American interests and all of this stuff, it is in some ways, in terms of story, if you think of the story as I told you, which is that with the destruction of Jerusalem, Rome kind of scatters the Jews. And then in its conversion to Christianity, not only does it scatter the Jews, but it also places Jews in a very weird position of being, in some ways, the margin of their story, and being kind of on the edge, and being a kind of in terms of, if you think, like I said, like a kind of free-floating, non-bound thing in the system that is mediating certain parts that are harder to mediate without them. Like all of that, once you come to this, you could say, situation where now these people now have an actual country, everything becomes weirder, and it's harder to understand what's going on, because on the one hand they continue to play this kind of international role of mediating parts as they did before, but they also at the same time have now a nation that they call their own. This in a time when, because of the World War II consensus, we we're starting to hate nations. We are starting to say that nations are images of fascism, and we need to move towards post-national states and post-national realities and kind of globalist things. Amidst that, you have one nation that still is, for all intents and purposes, an ethnic or ethno-religious state. And so what does that even, like, what's going on? What's happening, right? And so this is, I think, this is the issue that is kind of knocking everything together. And you can see it because on the one hand, you have the people on the extreme left that are saying Israel is just one more example of a fascist state, right? And then you have people on the right, even on the extreme right, saying, why do they get a nation but we don't have a nation? Why is it that they get to be an ethno state, but we don't have the right to be an ethno state? What's going on there? So you have these weird extremes that are colliding and colliding on Israel for like opposite reasons.
But it's so bizarre, and it's paradoxical though, because all we're being simultaneously fed by this same kind of mentality. I don't want to call it necessarily a mind virus, but there is a mentality that goes along with this, is that, be proud of who you are. Identity is great. Honor your identity, celebrate identity. But then here you have a country that is established that knows its boundaries, and there seems to be this repulsion to the Western mind that Israel has these boundaries, and there's this constant like protest that Israel needs to break up these boundaries and let other countries kind of formulate part of them, or that they need to be disappeared altogether. And they're doing the very thing which has ensured the survival of civilization since time immemorial, but the West is hating on it. It's just, it's weird. I keep saying it's weird because there's no other word for it.
Yeah, but man. Oh, this is hard stuff. It's not that hard to understand what's happening. It's like we can be sad about it and kind of wish we could find some kind of solution, but it's not that hard to understand what's going on. Like, so in the post-war, let's say, mythology, as the post-war mythology increases, we're actually not allowed to celebrate identity. We're allowed to celebrate revolutionary identity. That's the only identity we're allowed to celebrate. And therefore, the only identities that now become prominent that we can celebrate are minorities, people that are excluded, by systems, people that are oppressed by systems, people that are ambiguous, people that are that don't have a place in the normal, let's say, kind of abiding identity. So those are the identities we're allowed to celebrate. That's what pride is. That's what all of these things, these new things that we celebrate. And so now you have this weird contradiction, like I said, in Israel, which is that on the one hand, its existence can be portrayed as finally those people that for 2,000 years have been excluded and marginalized and beat up upon, finally they have their chance to now have something of their own, right? So you can formulate the identity that way, okay? But in doing that, they're creating a nation that is trying to push out those that don't belong in their nation, right? They're trying to kind of remove the people that are hostile to them, remove the people that don't fit in their national identity, increase their borders. And so now you can also, for the same group, you can also say, well, look at how they're acting like the other part of the World War II consensus, which is they're a nation with with a superiority complex who think they're the best in the world, they're the chosen by God, and now they're excluding people that don't belong in their religious ethno identity. So that's why, like, it's all happening there. It's like, that's why you can't, people who say, well, we just stop paying attention to Israel and we should just, like, America first, we could just care about America or care about it. It's like, you don't understand, this story is bigger than you. And like I said, I don't know exactly what the solution is, but it's all happening. It's definitely going to happen there.
Yeah. And okay, so even just there's, again, just we could probably spend. I wish we had more time. We might have to do like more of these conversations, but we've got plenty of time now. But there's almost even the extra layer of this, which is Christ on the cross in Israel, which is the symbol of the cross, kind of converging the quadrants into this like one place, like an X on the map. There seems to be this like. There's something about this convergence.
Yeah, well, Jesus, okay, so that's a good place to go, because in some ways you could say that the union of all those symbols that I talked about now, and how the kind of paradoxical or contradictory element of Israel is manifesting, was there in Christ, because Christ is the victim, right? Christ is the innocent victim in the story. He is killed by everyone, right? He's killed by the Romans, by the Jews. He's abandoned by his own followers. It's like everybody turns on him. But the thing is that as he's being crucified, he's also being called the king. And so there's a sign above his head that says that he's the king. There, he's dressed up as a king, and in a weird kind of double inversion, he's mocked for being the king when he actually is secretly the king at the same time. And so the cross becomes this center of the world. It reveals Jerusalem again as the center of the cosmos, but it does so in a way that is completely paradoxical, because Christ is being murdered by the people who are there, right? He's being killed, and so it's hard to totally hold that together. It's like the sacred smashes the categories together, and so that's definitely an example where you can kind of see it all coming together, and manifesting the center as this union of all these elements together. So yeah, it's wild.
Let's spend a little bit of time on this before we go into a different topic, because when I had Greg Hurwitz on the show, who I know is a colleague and friend of yours, we were kind of talking about some of the things that you've helped bring to light, and one of those was also even just the idea of Christ being born in the manger between the donkey or the ass and the ox as a symbol of purity and impurity. And there's this constant, and as you've described it countless times, like this fractal reemergence, constantly, like layering this constantly. And I don't really have a question as such for this. It's more just that, like, what do you make of this constant reemergence of this pattern? And is it pointing at something like fundamental in existence, in reality, but also as a kind of guiding light that we need to be sort of looking to? Because like one of the big problems and one of the things that Greg is working hard on is depolarization. Like how do we take this divided America, divided West, and just stop people freaking out on either side of the spectrum? A lot of that's been spurred on by foreign interference, by the likes of the Islamic regime, by the CCP, by Russia. And like, we're just not speaking to each other anymore. Like we like, especially with Israel, like we just don't know how to talk to each other anymore. And there seems to be almost like a little hint in this image of the cross of just like being able to integrate everything, you know? Like, do you have anything to say on those visuals?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the imagery of Christ, being born, dying between the good and the bad thief, like you said, being born between the pure and the impure. Like this is, of course, Christ smashes all of this symbolism together. He kind of reveals what the sacred is. He reveals what the center of the world looks like, and I think that that's true. That in order for us to regain some kind of center or regain, or if we can mediate the opposites, it's going to be painful. It's going to be painful, and we can't, and it's very difficult because we all tend to see. So for example, like I think, like let's say in difference with Greg, like I love Greg, he's my friend, and I think he's one of the smartest people I know. It's like that. Let's say the influence of the CCP and the influence of the Russia and of Qatar, or all of these other influences, let's say, on our media system. That's also true. But like, there's also the influence of Israel. Like those that is also happening. And so all of that is happening, and we need to be able to acknowledge and mediate that. So if you're allowed to say one, but you're not allowed to say the other, or if you say one and you don't say the other, this is where it's like we can't pull out. Like we're stuck in a story that's crumbling. We're stuck in a story that is falling apart. So we have to be able to see the whole. We have to be able to see the whole thing. And I think that there has to be a way to reintegrate this story. I don't know. Like I said, I don't totally know what it is. But we have to be able to reintegrate. We have to be able to break the taboos. Like what I would like to see in some ways is, how can I say this? Like I would like to see the Jewish people be able to be proud of who they are and kind of have their place in the world, but also that we be allowed to criticize them both at the same time. Like I think that would be very important that happens, so we can diffuse some of the crazy stuff that's going on. I think that the Germans should be able to be proud of their nation and proud of who they are and their history and everything that they brought them to where they are, and at the same time be critical of those moments in their history where they faltered, and critical of the places where things have gone wrong. And it's the same with Russia. Like it's the same. These if we're not able to reintegrate our stories and start to think of ourselves, this is a good important thing, to start to remember, to start to see ourselves as continuous instead of constantly wanting to break with the past and see ourselves as revolutionary. I think that there's no solution to the problem.
So by that explanation, and I share that feeling, it would seem then that in order to get there, we do need to destroy the post-World War II consensus, because like you said, it's not the Jews that are saying we can't criticize us so much as it is the story about the Jews that we're all occupying that means that it's very difficult to criticize the Jews. And like, look, I've got Jewish friends and Israeli friends, and they criticize, like it's the classic kind of Jewish humor. Like they constantly self-deprecate themselves, they criticize their own governments, but it's like outside in the kind of ether almost. Like there's this difficulty in doing so, but that narrative tension which you described earlier in our conversation is that post-World War II consensus,
Yeah.
which
the
we'd have to destroy.
Is we don't have to destroy it. It's getting destroyed. It's gonna happen. Like there's no. It's just something that will happen because it doesn't have enough strength to hold the world together for 1,000 years. Like it just doesn't. it had a certain thrust, and it had a certain real, let's say, capacity to hold us together in very positive ways, but it also had side effects, and it also had a kind of a dark side that is now playing itself out in ways that if we ignore to our peril, like we have to kind of face it. And if we don't, it's just going to happen. The best thing would be for all of us to be able to mediate this together, to be able to talk about these things in ways to be able to mediate them in a way that would land the ship in a manner that won't be a complete collapse.
I guess I'm trying to think of this in terms of, like, if I was someone in Israel right now, or living in that region, like, what would I think about this? It's like, I think, how do you even get to a place where you're able to mediate this if you have nations on your border who want the absolute annihilation of you? Like, whether that be pretty much in the constitution of the Islamic Republic, like not verbatim, but it kind of in the 12 Shia Islam, which dominates the theology of Iran. It's basically that all of the evil in the world is kind of symbolized by the state of Israel. And so for them, their Messiah doesn't come along until the destruction of Israel happens. And so it's like, how do you mediate that? Like, if you've got this kind of radical jihadist mentality that is the opposite of the Christian martyrdom, like, how do you even get to a place where there becomes like a global narrative change?
Yeah.
Like, and I'm not expecting you to have like an answer to this, but there's very real difficulties.
So let's reformulate what you said and try to see the whole picture. And I think that this is important because it's very difficult to see the whole picture. So it's worse than what you say, right? Because you have, on the one hand, like you said, you have these crazy Islamic fundamentalists that see the very existence of Israel as a nation, as a kind of eschatological obstacle that has to be overcome in order for Christ to return, and judge the world, right? And then you have a people who say that they're chosen by God and that are moving towards the return of borders that haven't existed in thousands and thousands of years, and will do everything to reach those borders, right? And so you have another sacred story, which is that story. And that story is also playing itself out. Like, there's as much desire on that side to reach a kind of eschatological moment where we're going to rebuild the third temple, and we're going to restart the sacrifice system, and we're going to come back to the border that were promised to Abraham 3,000 years ago, right? So there's that. Then there's also a whole huge amount of Christians who think that also has to happen, so that now it's the opposite of the other one. Like, that has to happen so that the same Christ that the Shiites are waiting for after the destruction of Jerusalem, we actually have to rebuild the temple and then restart the sacrifice system so that that same Christ will now return and judge the world. So you have three, like, huge, massive, like, religious eschatological systems that are butting up against each other and are motivating the continuation, the perpetuation of this conflict. I do not have a solution to that, Ali.
Yeah. Are you serious? Are you serious,
It's important to be able to see what exactly it is that we're facing. And a lot of people, and I want to be careful, because secular people watching this or listening to this will say, "Oh, there we go again. These religious nuts that are just going to bring about the end of the world." But the problem is that there's the last one again, which is the post-war consensus is a secular consensus, right? It's a secular idea of the world, and that is also in the mix and causing massive amounts of insane chaos, and is bringing about the problem. So you have all of these things that are like circling around the center of the world, right? Just like jumbling and fighting and arguing and all around the very point around which the world turns. And at least it's revealing to you that Jerusalem is the center of the world, folks. Like, you can't get rid of that. Like, it just is. And so I don't know what the solution is, but I do know that there are, like, I think that if Christians and Jews and Muslims who who do not wish for massacre and catastrophe, especially I think Christians who believe that we're called to love our neighbors and to love our enemies, and to manifest Christ into the world, that I think that there are things that we can do even at a small scale to, like I said, help land the ship in a way that won't be completely catastrophic. And yeah. Sorry,
Yeah.
I'm
No,
being a
no.
little apocalyptic here.
I think you mentioned like secular people listening to us. I've tried speaking to my atheist friends and try to communicate some of this stuff, and a lot of it just goes over their head, unfortunately. And I often then have to just bring it back to like you just can't avoid a belief system. Like everyone has a belief system, and you might not call it God, but there are certain things that you not so much worship so much as you like put at the absolute top of your value system, and like your entire sense of morality, those kinds of things, right and wrong, like it becomes a religion in some sense of the word. And unfortunately, like for all the all the criticism that people can point, the new atheist can point to religion, look how it makes people irrational and dumb and believe all this kind of stuff. Is like, well, you guys also have the very same thing. Like, you stare at me blank faced and say that a man is a woman and all this kind of stuff. And it's like some of the end points of the kind of, if you take Darwinian, materialistic, atheistic ideology to its like logical conclusion, like just nothing has any meaning, everything's vapid, there's no point in anything, and the logical endpoint is that we all get vasectomies, none of us have kids, and we just do voluntary extinction because suffering is bad. And in a sense, the atheist Darwinian materialists like worship anti-suffering because they can't integrate suffering and death into the picture. Whereas at least within the entire theological world, and I'll just speak from the Orthodox perspective, like suffering is not only integrated, but it's kind of like centralized in the symbol of the cross. And so it's like one ideology versus the next, which one's I don't want to say which one's better, but like you from an atheist perspective, you just can't avoid this stuff. And so I think one of the things that you've been tremendous at doing is bridging the chasm between the secular mind and the mythical mind, the symbolic mind, and the sort of right brain hemisphere. And being able to make these kind of connections and leaps through language, like I guess I just tried to attempt doing just then.
Yeah.
But
and one of the things that's important also to notice is that you could say that the 20th century and, the World War I, World War II, the communist regimes and the fascist regimes, they're secular, kind of ideologies that were butting against each other. And one of the things about the end of the post-World War II consensus is also the end of secularity. Right? It is in some ways that secular world having run its course and shown that it is not capable of giving people a sense of meaning and purpose and of cohesion, around which to congregate. And so as we're noticing, so like I talked about all these eschatologies kind of jumbling together towards Jerusalem, running towards Jerusalem. In some ways, that's kind of par for the course, in the sense that as the sacred, you could say, or sacred thinking, or vertical causality, or however you want to talk about it, reenchantment is the word a lot of people are using. As that's returning, right? It's coming with a bang. It's coming with a huge wave of all these weird enthusiasms that are kind of crashing together. And so it's something that in some ways is just happening to us. And so I think that's why in some ways the only call you can have is for sane people, like prayerful people, to advance with wisdom towards the other. There's no other way to do it, and the idea, for example, like I see a lot of kind of Christian themed anti-Judaism online, like really, like you said, you've seen it too, like a lot, very, very aggressive, very, very hateful. And you're thinking, I don't know, man, I don't see Jesus in that. I don't see Christ there. I think you can criticize Judaism, you can criticize some things that people have done, you can criticize the state of Israel, but this kind of bile against the people, against individuals, is not. I don't see that in the Christian way.
Yeah, I agree. I had to make a response video to Candace Owens kind of on a similar train of thought. It was, I'm seeing a lot of this stuff too, and it's not making sense. And look, I'm not in a position to sort of say that some Christians are worse than others, but there are certain fundamentals towards Christian belief that just get contradicted when people go on the internet and start talking like this, and then claiming that they're representing Christianity. Then that's where it becomes a big no-no and a big problem. And just while we're on the Christian theology here, and just the structure of belief that it affords and what flows downstream from Christian belief, while we're talking about these eschatologies and this kind of apocalyptic endgame scenarios for these various religions, I was wondering whether there is something about Christ that kind of has a way out of this, and you'll have to work with me here because your theology would be better than mine, but there's a sense that the New Jerusalem, as it's understood within the church, is different from the physical geographical location of the Israeli Jerusalem, and that there is a sense that the center of the world moves from Israel and Jerusalem in the Christian story, in the Christian theology, to essentially, am I right in saying the heart of everyone, that we all kind of in some sense are a little fragment of that, and especially it's the case in churches around the world, and that it kind of automatically just pulls us out of that kind of sinkhole, because it's now, the temple was destroyed, the second temple, as Christ prophesied, as Christ said would happen shortly after his crucifixion and resurrection. It did happen, and things spread, and then through some strange miracles ended up converting the entire Roman Empire, and here we are today. And so I'm just wondering whether, not to sound too Bible, I don't know what the criticism of something like this would be, that Christ is the answer, but there does seem to be something in here where Christ can there's a way out through the Christian story.
Well, for sure. I think that one of the things that happens in Christianity is that the center, like you said, is distributed in Christ, because of the idea of the incarnation, in the sense, the altar of every church in the world is, for all intents and purposes, in Jerusalem, right? It's like it is in the holy place of the holy altar in any church in the world is equivalent to the holy place in Jerusalem. Christians did not abandon their veneration of Jerusalem, because obviously Constantine and his mother refound Jerusalem. They, in some ways, refound it as a Christian place. We found the sacred spaces and everything, and then it becomes a place of pilgrimage for Christians, for generations after. But like you said, there is a way in which we understand that the New Jerusalem, or the heavenly Jerusalem, is a cosmic one. It is not one that is only bound to a certain place or to a certain thing. But it doesn't mean that we completely, we're not Gnostics, right? We also believe that these things embed themselves in places and have historical contingency as part of them. But in some ways, like you said, what it can do is it can also remind us that the true Jerusalem, like the true heavenly Jerusalem, is the one, of course, that you foster in your heart. In some ways, that is the most important one, right? This union of heaven and earth that can happen in the world, and the center, like you can become by embracing Christ and by becoming holy, you can become, for all intents and purposes, a little Jerusalem in the world, and can be a little anchor for the world. And that's what the saints are. The saints act that way. They are. They are temples, they are anchors that hold the world together. And so, like you said, I think it can in some ways diffuse us from the madness of thinking that the only thing that matters is the actual city and the physical place and everything. But it also, it's not going to, how can I say this? Jerusalem is still going to be the center of the world, and it's still going to play that role for all good and ill. Whatever intentions people have, it's still going to play that role. We can't get away from it.
Yeah, I love the way you just said that. I've heard you say that before, that these churches are holding the world together. But if you catch my drift, and we're talking about essentially what is apocalyptic visions of the eschatology of all of this, it's like there's something depolarizing and pressure valve releasing of this idea that by having these sort of mini Jerusalems everywhere, it's keeping the world together from a nuclear holocaust of us all fighting over this in some sense. And that there's just something interesting about that, and not to mention the fact that for the Christians, the Messiah has already come. And so a lot of the, the waiting of the coming one is kind of different. And for us, the sort of day of judgment it's not like a given date. It could be tomorrow. It could be whenever. And this has really frustrated a lot of people within Christianity. It's like, you don't know, but there's a really big importance to this, because it's not like you just you're off the hook and then there's a certain date and then you'll start acting good, so to speak. But you're on your guard.
Yeah, and also we have at least in the Orthodox tradition, for sure, we have a sense in which that eschatological moment is always available to all people all the time. And so in some ways, the return of Christ, or the participation in the end of things, is possible for the saints. It's possible for people that, as you come close to Christ, in some ways the eschaton becomes available to you now. And that's really the traditional interpretation of the church, by the way. One of the things that made the book of Revelation finally really accepted by the church, because it was very edgy at the outset. It wasn't clear if this book would be accepted, was that understanding, which is in some ways that it's a structural description of reality, and that we, the symbolism doesn't just apply to some time in the future, but that it has a permanent reality that we can participate in, and that the heavenly Jerusalem is available to those that are completely united to Christ. They can enter the New Jerusalem now. Like it's definitely possible.
Yeah. There's again so much to cover there. I wanted to just shift gears a little bit and then perhaps return, if we still have time, to the symbolism of the cross and all that flows from there, especially in relation to some of the symbolism of Genesis and fruit and trees and all that kind of stuff. But Greg Hurwitz, who again was on the show and is a friend and colleague of yours, he described you as a holy person, and I thought that was really beautiful. And it was during a talk you guys actually gave at university, and I caught that little description, and I was just wondering, because I've noticed this in the way you conduct yourself. I was wondering how you navigate this line between the political and the sacred, because St. Isaac the Syrian once said that there's one thing more powerful than 1,000 armies, and that's a pure heart in the wilderness. And I thought it was beautiful. And I often find myself walking this tension, this difficult line between wanting to just retreat into solitude. And I think if every man is being honest with himself, there's something about solitude and return to some, whether that be the forest. I think your brother, I saw him in a video. He's out in the snowy somewhere. There's this tension for me to retreat into solitude and just not be reactive to the state of the world and the news and creating content in a reactive state. But also there's this sort of responsibility that I feel to, whether you speak truthfully or publicly, perhaps if it's controversial, because, Solzhenitsyn, he warned that a lot of the evils that, flowed from the Soviet Union was a result of two things, really. It was man had forgotten God, but also that people were living by lies. And I don't find myself wanting to fall for either one of those traps. And so I admire the way you've conducted yourself and how you've gone about, commenting on the world whilst also kind of staying grounded. And I just was wondering, how you navigate that line between the sacred and the political, whether it's come naturally to you, whether there's any practice or anything that you can maybe share, because I think there's a lot of people that are probably struggling with this.
Yeah. It's not easy. I really dislike talking about politics. Like all the things we're talking about now, they make my heart bleed. You have no idea. I do not enjoy talking about these things. I wish in some ways that I didn't have to. I think that the only advice I could give to people is to not be reactive. And I've fallen prey to that many times. It's like I always tell people, if you see me posting on Twitter a lot, I'm not doing well. Like you'll know that it means I'm not well. And so the first thing I think is to not be reactive, right? And to kind of hold your tongue, to turn your tongue, 7 times before saying anything. I think that's important, and to meditate on the reason why you would say anything. If you're just angry and you want to denounce things and you want to attack and you want to cause harm or you want to harm people that you dislike or that you're angry at, that is not a good motivation to speak. And so And like I said, I'm not saying I haven't fallen prey to that. I have, definitely. But if you're asking me for what I'm trying to make me guide my decisions, that is definitely part of it. I try to ask myself, what is the purpose? Like, what am I trying to serve when I say this? If I criticize something, if I talk about, let's say, like I talked about now, the relationship between Christians and Jews, it's a difficult subject to talk about. Why am I doing it? And if I can take the time and calm down and pray and peer into that, and I can say, I think I'm doing it because I want to see the best, the greatest good for most people. Like I want to help people see something that will bring about hopefully the best for everyone involved. Even, whether it's your enemy, whether it's your friend, whether it's your ally. I would say that's to love your enemies is probably the best way to think about that in general in terms of politics, is to think, if I'm saying something against the woke, or if I'm saying something against this group or the Republicans or the Democrats, like, do I love my enemy? And not in the sense that I'm pretending they're not my enemy. Maybe they are my enemy. Maybe I know they're opposing me in this particular conflict. But am I saying it in a way that I want the best for them as well? Like, I want the best for my side, but I also want the best for the people that represent the other side. I know that's hard, but I think that's probably a good way of thinking about what loving your enemy can mean in these kinds of situations. It doesn't mean you're not going to fight. Sometimes you are, right? Sometimes you are going to have to engage in the conflict, but I think that's probably the best stance you can have.
Yeah, and there's what's frustrating, as you also grapple with this problem of dealing with the internet and social media, and unfortunately, it seems that like if it was up to me, like I would spend my days making videos about the church fathers and iconography and all that kind of stuff, and like get 3 views, and that there is a reality to the economics of definitely making content online, but it draws you in, and it takes like the worst of you, and it's like after you do a few videos that like, whoa, that got more views if I phrased it like that, it draws you in, and it kind of brings the worst out of you. And so sometimes I feel like making like a disclaimer. Sometimes it's like, look guys, like, this isn't really the real me you're getting. Like you're getting like a certain slither of my thoughts on the world, that might be highly curated, but like, this isn't how I live my life. Like there's so much more. Like, I'm a father, I've got kids, and just like my day to day is not focusing on whether Iran has nukes. It's like, have we done the washing today? Like, have we, are the kids fed? Are they doing well? That kind of stuff. And it's, but regardless, I think I just want to say, whether you've got issues in the temptation of reactivism and being impulsive online. Nevertheless, I've been inspired by the way you've conducted yourself in walking that line, and I do find that you've been able to stay very grounded, and I think it shows that there is a way to talk about this stuff without getting lost in it, and I think that's something that we can all learn from.
Well, thank you. I mean, I do get lost. Like if you ask my wife, she would say that I'm completely unreasonable because I have the emotions, I have the reaction. I'm like, why another war? Are we going into another? Like, are we really going to war again in the Middle East again? And so I have the reaction, But then one of the things I would say for people that are like making content, it's hard because you're trying to feed the algorithm because people try to get attention. But one of my key things is to wait. I never react hot. Like I tried, I've done it, but I rarely make a video immediately after something happened, right? It's like, let's say even like, the Kanye West made that song, and I was like, I know I'm gonna have to talk about this, but I waited like 2 weeks, 3 weeks in order to get out of the algorithm, in order to get out of the rage bait, like fight. Another thing, by the way, that I know this is rough, but one thing, by the way, is I almost never tag people on Twitter. Like, it's a very simple one. It's like, if you don't tag people on Twitter, first of all, you'll get less views. That's true. But you also will get in less fights. And so I do get in fights on Twitter. But when I do, I then slap myself and think, what's the point here? So I would say, like, they're little things, but I would say to not act out of emotion,
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Okay, so speaking of, wanting to just talk about icons all day, I do want to get your thoughts on art. And so maybe we can have our little moment in this video that we've talked quite a lot. There's some outrageous stuff that we've talked about. There's probably a little bit more outrageous stuff if we can get time to talk about it. But on the topic of art and architecture and the sacred and how it shapes the world and why what we gaze upon becomes us in some real sense, I wanted to ask you about what has gone wrong in the world of art, certainly in the world of film, and why the downfall of art has had such a tragic ramification on society.
Yeah. It's a long story, like you say, the downfall of art. I think that it has deep roots even in the way that we think arts function. So most people think of art, ultimately they think of it in some way as a consumable. They maybe wouldn't use that word, but they tend to think of it that way, like the idea of a performer and a public, or the idea of an art object and a viewer. So we have this idea that in some ways art is something that's produced by someone, and then we as viewers, as spectators, as that we consume it. There's nothing wrong per se with the fact that happens, but that's already a deep gouge in what art should be or can be or it has been in ancient civilizations. The idea is mostly that art is really participation. That's the most important aspect of what art is. That's why, in my movement towards art, I moved towards making church art right away, because it was a fast, easy way to recapture participation. Because if I make an icon, I'm not making it just for someone to put up on their wall to decorate, or for prestige, or for them to be able to brag to their friends that they have this or that artist. I'm making it to celebrate a certain saint, to celebrate a certain feast, to participate in someone's prayer life, to be entered into the church, and to participate in the liturgy. And so it kind of helps you remember what art can be in terms of its participation. And so that's the biggest thing. And that's why you could say that's why when I moved towards art, I returned to iconography right away. Now, like I said, I don't believe there's anything wrong with, watching a movie or being entertained by different types of the arts, you could say. But that has to be downstream in some ways from participation. If it isn't, then at some points it goes off the rails. And what we've seen is people have a deep intuition that in fact art is about participation. And so because we've lost the deep participation, what happens is art becomes participative in the sense that it becomes propaganda. Because propaganda is an easy way to make art participative. It's an easy way to say, oh, I'm fighting for a cause. I'm doing this for a reason. I'm not just entertaining lazy people in their couches. But propaganda is a very weak form of participation. It's a very narrow and annoying, because people sense it and they feel like you're actually manipulating them towards ideas. And that's what's happened with art. Is basically, in some ways, it's been taken over by ideology, because the deeper participation was lost even centuries ago. And so one of the things that I want to do is, through the iconography, but then also through bringing some of the tropes and the images and the ways of seeing that exist in liturgy and in iconography, by seeing if that can trickle down into popular culture with like fairy tale books that we're writing, or graphic novels, or ultimately even movies, or things like that. If we can also revive the arts in the literal sense, in the sense of, because without that, like we're doomed. Like we're just really doomed. Hollywood is collapsing, the publishing industry is collapsing, AI is coming in. If we have no way of knowing what true art is and what participation is, then AI, let's say generated drivel is going to completely invade us.
Yeah, for sure. I really there was something you said in a video once that was kind of like that beneath everything, like beneath all the politics, beneath all the kind of, political parties or social justice movements or just institutions, there's like a few basic things. I think you described it as like the making of space or narrative or art. I can't remember exactly what you said, but you were kind of inferring that fairy tales that we read our children, like at bedtime, are some of the most important things that our children will consume, a human being will consume, because it lays the foundational framework through which they can interpret reality. Because the characters, the story arcs, the challenges, the rights and the wrongs, and all those things are like the early architecture that forms in their minds that everything else gets kind of compared to as they grow up. And part of the danger or like tragedy I see here is that like the fairy tales that I grew up reading were like a cheap imitation of what like my great grandparents were reading, which was a cheap imitation of what their great grandparents were reading. We've got this kind of amnesia happening, and now with like my kids, like what's left is like the latest like Snow White movie that Disney's just put out. It's just there's just inversion after inversion, and there's now been this sort of strange appeal to the villain, kind of like we were talking with Hitler, how after a certain number of years, like villains become attractive characters, and now every movie seems to be like, oh, like let's do the counter narrative, and like actually the bad guy's the good guy, and all this kind of stuff, and where every moment that would have typically been a somber moment, a romantic moment, a moment of grief is like constantly punctuated by sarcastic jokes. I mean, this is the case in one of the Marvel movies.
Yeah, the Marvel movies have just been completely infected with that.
Every moment. And so today, like I find myself just craving like Tarkovsky movies, like 4-hour long, black and white, Russian, or Japanese movies that, the closest thing I get to it is like a Terrence Malick movie, like A Hidden Life. Like that's the closest I can get to that feeling. And watching one of those movies is good for me for like 3 years. Like that will keep me going. So there is do you feel like there's this danger in now what our kids are consuming and the mindset and the ideologies that will be formulated from them? Is that a worry? Is that trivial?
No, it's not. It's not trivial. It's important for people to understand what we mean when I say this, because it can sound like mumbo jumbo when you hear it at first, right? You say, well, fairy tales are this, the pattern or the basic building blocks of thinking. But the way that, especially fairy tales, are preserved, right? You can think of fairy tales as a kind of attuning storytelling mechanism that goes over generations and centuries and millennia, where certain stories are told and then certain stories are remembered and then certain stories are recounted. And that process, in some ways, then some stories are forgotten and then some stories are left, to the wayside. And those that are remembered, you have to think that there's a reason why they're remembered. It's not arbitrary. And even if people don't know why they're remembering and retelling them, it's the pattern of human attention, which is actually being kind of, let's say, finessed into a structure. So you have in fairy tales the pattern of at least the pattern of human attention. But human attention is not arbitrary. Human attention is based on the things that humans care about and the things that are important to humans. And so in those old stories, what you end up having is something like an attuning system, something that awakens the attention of the child or of the person, and then also compresses it in a way that helps you, let's say, like I said, it's almost like a tuning fork. And those are objective in the sense that you can't play with them so much. You can do it. You can try. And people are doing it now. But what's going to happen is that the Snow White movie that Disney just made, that movie, it is already forgotten. Like it was forgotten by the time you walked out of that movie. Like if you watch it 20 minutes later, you have forgotten that movie. It will not affect the deep storytelling. It will not be preserved. It will not be maintained. It will not be, perpetuated. And so, although there's a kind of despair that we have, which is that, maybe since the 1960s or 70s, there's been this ideological grasp on our storytelling and an infiltration of kind of, you could say, a weird communist or kind of weird proto-woke thing that has been slowly ingrained into our storytelling. We can also have the confidence that cannot maintain. It cannot be maintained. It will collapse because it leads to all kinds of insanity. It literally leads to a demographic collapse. It leads to people not having children. Like, if people don't have children, they're not going to perpetuate your stupid story. Like, it's just not going to happen. So I think that, and what's interesting now is as we see it collapse, like now that kind of rot has been in storytelling for many decades. But now, as it happens, like radically as we kind of see Hollywood just fall apart, the publishing industry fall apart, nobody caring about the stories that they're giving them, like people not even wanting to participate. There's an amazing opportunity. Like, it's a great opportunity for artists right now. It's a great opportunity for storytellers to tell the real stories, right? To tell the powerful ones, because those are real. Those will be remembered. Like, they will. People will recognize them even without knowing why. They'll see like a glimmer of something true in them, even if they can't rationally say why that is.
Yeah. I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you about some of this, how did you call it? There's this strange phenomena happening in music videos and pop culture and that kind of stuff, which is the rise of the occult. You know, whether that be the witchcraft stuff or the Freemasonry or the satanic imagery in music videos. And there are also these kind of darker claims that, you know, the elites are engaged in blood rituals and darker spiritual forces and all that kind of stuff. And I guess one of the questions is, like, you know, why do you think that has emerged in the first place? You've written about it and you've made videos about it, but why do you think that has emerged in the first place? And also, have we lost the language in the modern West to explain what demonic forces even are, that whether they're real or not, without just laughing it off as complete make-believe? There's the two questions there.
Yeah. So the first one you can understand from a story perspective, right? So, and it's similar to when you talked about Maleficent, or you talked about Disney stories, kind of putting the villain. One of the things that happens in a story setting is, right, you have a good guy. Often you have a good guy and a bad guy, and then the story plays out. So you have a way in which the story kind of plays itself out through your attention, through. But if you maintain that story for a long time, one of the things that happens is that you could say the side effects of the story start to show themselves as it plays itself out, and as it peters out, you could say. Then the things that were put in the margins, like the things that were kind of cast out as the bad guy, or as the things to be ignored, or as the thing to be kind of stepped down upon, they start to exercise a kind of fascination on people. You can imagine that people are moving away from the center into the margin, and then the margin starts to kind of glimmer with a strange light, and so then what you end up having is a desire to tell the upside down story, a desire to tell the story from the perspective of the villain. There are many versions of that. Some of those versions are not benign, but are nearly benign. Like, a good example is how, as the Hellenistic world subsided and the Romans became ascendant, they started to tell the Trojan War story from the perspective of the Trojans. And that became the Aeneid and became the entire structure of the West, which is that we maintain the Iliad, but the Iliad told from the perspective of the Trojans. And so now we're not even able to read the Trojan War. It's very difficult to read the Iliad and to think of the Trojan War without considering the Trojans as being kind of more heroic in their defense of their people, and seeing the Greeks as kind of brash and irrespectful and everything. So it's, some of it can be benign, but in our case it's far from being benign, which is that now what's happening as Christianity kind of comes to its end, or is petering out, then people are taking the stories of those that have been marginalized in Christianity and are making those into heroes. And so the celebration of witches, even whether or not witches even existed at the time, or whether existed or not, it doesn't matter. What matters is the story. So now you have people identifying as witches, not only witches, as the witches that were burnt in the 16th century. They're identifying as that. They're saying, we are the witches you burnt, and we are now in power. We are alive. We are casting curses on the president. We are, doing that. And so that's why, and the satanic imagery is the same, right? And so everything that has been kind of pushed out is now rising up. And so the revolutionary trope, all the revolutionary trope ends up ultimately mythologically representing a kind of satanic trope. You see that in heavy metal music, like if you look at the kind of the heavy metal moment, it's like people realize that rebellion mythologically has the shape of the devil, right? And then you read Milton, and then all of a sudden, the Milton's Lucifer now is the hero of the story. And Milton had no intention of that being the case, right? The way Milton wrote his Paradise Lost was not that Lucifer would be the hero, but now it's almost inevitable that now Milton's Lucifer has become the hero of a Netflix series through Neil Gaiman and through all of these weird permutations, where now you have a series about Lucifer, and he's the hero of the story. So this is something that in some ways is kind of inevitable as you reach the end of a story. It's the carnival moment, right? It's the moment where everything is upside down. It's the clown world moment. All of that is part of the game. People shouldn't be shocked, shouldn't be surprised. One of the hardest elements in the thing you said, which is like the conspiracy idea that the elites are involved in this. This is a very dangerous moment. Whether it's factually true or not, these things are secondary to how the story plays itself out. Because the very fact that we see our own elites as being against us, as having other interests, as having satanic interests, you could say, as having lizard people, they're the lizard people. They have other interests. They're our elites, but they don't care for us. They don't have any attention to us. They're not there to help us. They're actually against us. That is it's a very dangerous moment in the clown world upside down reality. But of course, clown world cannot sustain itself, right? At some point, the story comes back. At some point, the carnival ends, and so we'll see how that happens. And it's weird because when we talked about World War II consensus, like we talk about the Ouroboros eating its tail, like entering into a revolutionary mindset, right? So think about it this way. My brother talks about this a lot, and it's very powerful. It's something called the double inversion. It's like if you turn the world upside down, you create a weird thing, which is that the upside down has a tendency to want to come back. And so you can play it out this way. Think about it this way. You create a world in which the margins are celebrated. You create a world in which the excluded are the ones that are the secret heroes of the story. You create a whole narrative in which, ultimately the devil is the hero. Like the devil is the one that stood up against the tyrant in heaven and declared his own independence from this horrible evil tyranny. And then while you're doing that, right, you're creating this new devil, right? This little mustachy devil. And you're saying he's the most evil thing that ever existed. And look at how evil he is, and he's a tyrant, and he's these things. But you don't realize that the very structure of your world is leading to, at some point, people saying, oh, well, maybe the devil is the one that was right. And so in the very World War II consensus, in the very inversion of the story, where now the nameless and the proletariat, or the people that are in the margins, that they are the ones that are right, and they are the ones that have to be brought to king. In that very structure is the path by which the whole thing flips back, and you come back to a crazy, insane tyranny. And so it's like, these are like, I don't know if I've ever explained it as clearly as I just did now, but it's like you can see how these things play themselves out. It's very difficult to avoid them. And so if you celebrate Ozzy Osbourne and his kind of satanic tendency to on stage represent all the taboos and to break all the taboos and to break all the let's say the Christian vision of what's up and what's down, and then you're surprised that the guys on 4chan are doing that for the other devil. It's like, you set it up, folks.
Right.
You set it up for it to happen.
Yeah.
Right, so one of the problems that we have in understanding how demonic forces, or how you could call transpersonal agency, how intelligences that are not human or that are higher or beyond humanity act on us, is in some ways because we've been living in this weird, flat, secular world, and we have no way of understanding this except for science fiction, weird thinking. Because we think everything is flat, we wonder, like, how do these demons exist? Like, where are they? What bodies do they have? We have a kind of horror movie vision of what we're talking about when we talk about these intelligences. But when you understand, like, even just understanding how stories act on us, even understanding in some ways how I've tried to explain how there are constraints in narratives that in some ways direct your attention and direct your action in ways that you can't completely undo, or you can undo with great difficulty. Like I said, if I go to the store to get some milk, I'm not going to come back and go to another city. I'm going to come back to my house. There's a narrative constraint that directs my action towards certain things. And those are intelligent. There's a good way of thinking about it. Now, the way to understand transpersonal agency is to understand that there are these types of structures, these types of acting intelligences on us that direct our action towards purposes. And some of them are, you could call it parasitic. Like some of them have their own kind of self-destructive pattern them, and they bring you into a kind of self-destructive. So a good way of thinking about it is you could think that anger is a motivational thing that you experience inside you, right? It directs your action towards a goal. But you can recognize anger in other people. Like I know anger when I see it. I don't just experience it in me. I see it happen in you. And then I can also see it in a mob. Oh, what the hell is that? What is this anger that's manifesting in a mob? And I can see it happening at different scales. And so I realized that anger is a intelligent pattern that's moving towards purposes. And there's an aspect of it, you could say, the demon of anger, that is very dangerous. If you give in to it and you kind of follow it to its logical conclusion, it leads to destruction, right? It leads us to our destruction. So you could say the same for mammon. If you think about, let's say, the demon of money or the demon of greed, you know, that demon, I can see it, I feel it in me. I feel greed in me. And then I see it acting on our societies, on the markets. I see it acting on the decisions that are being made. And then I can say, oh, people worship mammon. Like people worship this demon. And by celebrating it, that is, by saying that, let's say, the market is the most important thing. Like you hear presidents say that. Like, the economy is the most important thing. It's like, really? Is the economy really the most important thing? That's an insane thing to say from a Christian perspective. The economy is not the most important thing. You know, loving God and loving your neighbor, that grounds everything else. But if you say the market is the most important thing, or the economy is the most important thing, then that has consequences. And so you could say that the demon is leading us, and it leads us towards destructive behaviors. And so, you know, it's really important to, and so the imagery that we have is fine. Like the more science fiction or the more mythological imagery is okay, and it's necessary. It's important to kind of understand it, but it's also important to kind of understand that it's not arbitrary. Like these things are not just these arbitrary beings that are acting against us. They're motivational wills that are gathering us into their body, you could say, that are making us their body. Like when you're angry and you get possessed by anger, you are the body of anger in the world. You are in some ways increasing anger in reality, right? And especially anger is a good one because you're going to foster it in others, and you're going to act as an enemy. And then all of a sudden, the god of war even going to manifest himself, and then you'll see, you know, people acting in ways they don't even want to act. They know they're heading towards their own destruction, yet they're doing it anyways. And so these are things that I think even secular people can start to understand again. And if we don't understand it, then we don't have the tools to be able to fight it. We don't have the tools to be able to prevent these patterns from running through us and kind of possessing us and driving us towards chaos.
Yeah, absolutely. It's and I think that's a helpful way of connecting that chasm that I think you've been so helpful at being able to bridge this gap. You are bridging the gap for people in their understanding, but there's also a sort of literal a perspective of this as well, like a literal kind of demonic kind of force, which I think for a lot of people goes over their heads.
These are real wills. Like they're not just, how can I say this? You are a real will. You have the capacity to influence the world and to influence people around you and to influence reality. And these transpersonal wills, they're also absolutely real. They absolutely influence you. They're not human abstractions. They're not human projections. They exist through humans in the sense that they motivate us towards action. But they're not, I'm not trying to diminish them by trying to explain them or help people understand what they are. They really will act on you. It's like when the god of greed rules over a nation, that's a real thing. And it really rules. And it really leads people into directions that are destructive to their environment, are destructive to others, are destructive to the nations around them, all of that.
Okay, well, speaking about these kind of forces, if you will, that kind of can either be described as demonic, but I also think there's a way of describing things as archetypes, that people kind of fall into these archetypes. One of the things that I noticed recently was, Jordan Peterson, a colleague and friend of yours, was recently in some drama. There was a big debate that went viral. There was like 20 atheists versus him. And, people were criticizing him because they were trying to pin him down for what he believes about God and Christianity. And people were commenting on, his anger and his facial expressions and him kind of waving people away. And at that moment, it kind of struck me that, Peterson is embodying in that very moment the gargoyle archetype, that he's the great defender of the church on the outside without really kind of going in, and like with all the anger, he's trying to defend it and trying to usher people in. And I was just wondering whether you think, first of all, whether that's a fair archetype, but two, whether you think it's been a conscious kind of decision or choice that he will embody that kind of role as this kind of gargoyle to the church. Or I guess the third option to this is whether you think, like there's genuinely some struggles that Peterson is facing in terms of like integrating, let's say, a formal version of spirituality or religion into his life.
Yeah, I think all of those, what you said, are true. I think that, Jordan Peterson is Jordan Peterson. Like, people, once you get to know him, you realize he doesn't play games. Jordan Peterson doesn't play games. Like, what he says is what you see. And, on the one hand, I think he understands he's a genius. And so he understands that he's playing this weird role of being on the outside and kind of pointing people in. I think he completely understands that. I think that understanding is also completely aligned with his own doubts and his own difficulty in understanding why he should, for example, get baptized or actually enter into communion and enter into submission also to the church in a formal way. So I think that all those are playing out in him. And, people, in some ways, even in that debate, like I hated that debate. I thought everything about it was dishonest. Like, by the way, like if you don't know, that the organizers were dishonest in the outset. They told Jordan that it was going to be 20 atheists versus Jordan Peterson, and they told the atheists that it was going to be one Christian versus 20 atheists. And that's what the clash that you see is actually a clash that the people at Jubilee did on purpose. And know that because when they put out the video, they waited half a day and then they changed the title to kind of to increase the drama and to increase
wow.
Yeah, so it was really everything about it was really, to me, in my opinion, dishonest. So I didn't particularly like that debate. What was I saying? So, I mean, I think that Jordan's hesitancy is saying that he's a Christian, is real hesitancy. He's just, that's where he is. And he has a certain understanding, I think, of being a Christian, which is that he believes that it's more of an ethical stance and more of an ethical system. And therefore, I think that his position, this is my opinion here, I think that his position is that he wants to show the fruits of a Christian, and that those fruits will reveal what he really is and what he really believes. And that's why in some ways he almost feels like he would rather not say what he thinks and what he believes and just live it out so that people can see. But that for a traditional Christian, let's say like you or like I, that causes certain problems, because we also know that, people have literally died, just to not have to deny that Christ is God, like to have to, and so there's this idea in Christianity, which is also you have to confess. Like there is a confession that comes, like a actual verbal saying of the creed or of confessing what is true, that is also part of what it means to be Christian. You have to be baptized. There are all these things that you have to kind of engage in a communal way. It's not just about you and your ethical stance and your ethical position, but I think that that's something that he's still dealing with, still struggling with. He hasn't kind of figured out on how he can engage with that kind of reality. So, the first thing I would say though is that it's like Jordan Peterson is what you see is what you get. He's the furthest thing from a hypocrite I've ever found in my life. He is just who he is. What you see is what's there.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome to have that insight from you. Jonathan, there's not been a single guest on the show that I've been more desperate to try and rebook another slot with. I'd love to do this again, like, I don't know, in a month or two. Whenever you are free, let me know. I don't want to be that guy that's in your inbox trying to organize another one, but I've had so much fun today. Where can people find you? Where can people follow you and, get your books, get your work?
Yeah, so people can go to thesymbolicworld.com. That's where most of my stuff is. I have a YouTube channel. I talk about all these subjects, symbolism, talk about politics a little, not too much. But mostly what I'm trying to do now is trying to create culture. What Ali, what you mentioned is that as we watch culture collapse, we can criticize, we can complain, but one of the things we want to do is to create culture. And so we're revivifying all these fairy tales with beautiful books. We're moving in that direction. So people can check that out on thesymbolicworld.com.
Until next time, Jonathan, Godspeed.
Thanks.